Thank you. We will be taking turns speaking at the mic, so we'll try this. Just to be absolutely clear, we wrote the paper together as co-authors from the beginning, so it's not a last-minute thing that Maud is coming here. Actually, she's the brain, so I'm just trying to be funny here. All right, so basically our presentation will focus on a single question, but we're going to divide it and multiply it, just as Jesus the bread, so if you're partial to that. So what is the nature of a computer game player's experience? This experience is actually a composite of different dimensions, such as the technical, the techne, the ethical, the ethos, the aesthetic, the aestheticos, etc., etc. Etc. really is a key word here. We don't reduce the aesthetic experience to just these three facets, but there may be more involved. For the purpose of our paper, we're going to talk about the aesthetic, even though these dimensions cannot be envisioned separately from their combined effects and they function as an inseparable whole. We will need to focus more deeply on the aestheticos component of the aesthetic experience. So we're going to examine how it deploys itself in computer game play, and our approach aims, it's like it may succeed or it may fail, that's up to you, but we'd like to hear it, but our approach aims to be applicable to all types of video games, and even to modern games as a general property of what is the aesthetic experience.
Aesthetics considerations are more often associated with art, and when the question is raised regarding computer games, it is usual to debate whether this media can be seen as art or not, as we have seen before. And yet, thinking about the aesthetic computer game experience can exclude such consideration. Basing ourselves on John Dewey, we claim that the aesthetic experience cannot be reduced to the experience of art, and that it can be the experience of a computer game. However, we situate ourselves on the question of game as art. According to Dewey, any experience can become an aesthetic experience, for that kind of experience is not determined by a defined object, but rather by the lived experience of that object. In other words, the aesthetic experience defined by an object's given set of attributes, but by a set of criteria that define the experience dimensions. As an example, one could think about Trauma. It's an independent game created by Majewski. We would automatically yield an aesthetic experience given the game's artistic aims. Taken in the same vein as Myst, this game can lend itself to an aesthetic experience in and of itself, giving the originality of its gameplay and visual treatment. On the other hand, it can be a very boring game for certain players. We will not have an aesthetic experience if the game does not manage to steer their sensibilities. And they will rather turn away from it, an attitude that is contrary to what defines the aesthetic experience, as we will see later.
In this sense, no object can predetermine an aesthetic experience, so any experience can become an aesthetic experience. The aesthetic experience itself is an experience of the ordinary and not an external experience with other pretensions associated to the work of art, for instance. Rather, it is a showcasing of characteristics that the player himself selects. It is a way of magnifying some qualities of the object for enjoyment. As such, the aesthetic experience is nothing else than its self-enjoyment in an ever-unfolding present. It is not bound to a given object or phenomenon. It is lived for itself and constitutes an experience of the experience. It becomes its own end. We are going to use a framework that was put forth by Gibson in the ecological approach to visual perception. So the basic tenet of the ecological approach is that the subject and the environment cannot be thought of independently. Both are needed. And key to this, of course, is the concept of affordances that we've heard already. An affordance is a possibility of action that is offered by the environment to a given subject, and this is a key part of the definition, depending on its skills and knowledge. So a door can be openable to any one/thing that is tall enough to reach the doorknob, intelligent enough to operate it, strong enough to pull it, etc. But the very same door, if it's made out of wood, will be also chewable to a rodent, or it could be passable for a tiny insect that could go underneath the space of the door and the floor. So affordances in computer games are the result of the meeting of two types of attributes. That was actually good, even though it's not part of a plan. Two types of attributes, the in-game objects and rules, and the player's skills and knowledge. It's the meeting of the two. So for instance, you're playing Super Mario Brothers. You can, of course, use the game controller to control the distance at which you jump. You can turn around in mid-air, sort of, to an extent. This is your skill that will allow you to do that. As well, you can control the height of your jump. You can jump lower so as not to bump your head into the ceiling, etc. But you can't jump higher than what the program will let you do. So, of course, the game rules are there as well, and they constrain the limits to which you can manipulate your jumping. You can't jump back, like way, 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 way back. You can just jump semi-way back, just to the extent that the game rules allow them. Another really important thing is that in Super Mario Brothers, a skilled player may run at full speed and duck when you're as Super Mario. So this image shows Mario he's basically screwed. He can't go underneath because he's Super Mario. So the obvious solution that you've learned beforehand, because you already had a mushroom and you know that you can break bricks, you can just forge a path through it. But you can also execute the duck slide. So you just slide and duck. And if your timing is just right, you can just slide a bit under the blocks. So it's possible to do that. It wouldn't be possible, or at least you would be forced to do that if such a situation as the rightmost image, it's made up, it doesn't appear anywhere in the game. So the duck slide technique is something that the player goes through in and of himself. Like he decides to apply or to master this technique. It's never required explicitly by the game. So it's a player character affordance. It's executed through a player affordance, which requires a certain degree of skill. Using it falls under the scope of aesthetics. It's a personal preference by the player rather than the necessities of going through the game. So computer games are best thought of in ecological terms, since a given game must always work with an implied player, model player, or audience in mind. Now I know this is way larger than the time I can dedicate to this question here, the question of intended and et cetera, et cetera. It goes back to theories of interpretation. I've gone through that, but like we have to speed up for now. So if you want to ask questions later, we'll be happy to oblige. So we may say that whatever the game specifically requires and is not up to the player's freedom and free will in and of itself, it leans more strongly on the functional than on the aesthetic. The duck slide is an experience of the experience. You live through your duck slide because you like doing the duck slide, not because you have to do it. Overcoming the problem is necessary, but the player is free to develop his own creative approach to do so. Therefore, an investigation into the notions of imagination and creativity seems to be in order.
A player's imagination is what allows a reflexive return on the computer game experience so that the new ways of doing things can be actualized. For Dewey, imagination is a way to bridge the past and the future so that meaning can be produced. We could say that imagination allows the production of meaning through a player's past knowledge and experiences, the future experience of the game, and those which he shapes in the ongoing present. As computer games constantly present new situations, the act of playing is always focused in the present task, yet the task is part of a larger quest and network of relationships between objects, computational processes, and the gameplay systems that keep unfolding.
So let's say you're playing StarCraft, and things are cool. You've got your zealots, so little guys, they bash things, you're in control, and then you go, whoa, what the hell is this? Those big guys, they can shoot at a distance. Wow, this is going to solve all my problems. So you think to yourself, all right, I've got this new unit, now I'll win the game forever, and everything is going to be cool because I can shoot people from a distance. No, you don't. You don't. You know this is only a small part out of a larger sequence. So this is something that is in becoming, and it calls to attention the fact that, well, you know, you got a new unit, so your enemies will get new units as well. Case in point, when the Zerg gets the Defiler, and they start peppering little clouds there that prevent your units from shooting at a distance. So now you say, oh, okay, et cetera, et cetera.
When considered as part of an aesthetic experience of the game, the player is appropriating all of the game's elements to optimize its ever-renewed present and imagining the optimal ways of dealing with the upcoming obstacles. In this case, imagination is unifying the heterogeneous elements of the game in an idealized world of which an aesthetic experience is made. Imagination thus allows the anticipation of other unactualized possibles thanks to creation. We propose an hypothesis that Dewey's imagination is in fact the poiesis presented by pre-Socratic philosopher, since then taken up, among others, by Heidegger. Poiesis is then considered as a mode of disclosure of being, aletheia, an action of world building, a making manifest that which was non-existent before. Poiesis is responsible for the openness of being, and it is the source of creation and difference in the world. This creation can be envisioned on two levels, which we evoked earlier in our discussion on affordances, so what the player managed to achieve and what the game allows. Hence, the aesthetic experience of computer game play can be seen as the personal appropriation of game patterns and mechanics by the player, singular strategies and modes of play that showcase a subjectivity squarely outside the objectivity of the algorithm. The player must actualize what has not yet come to pass, thanks to the maximization of an idea included in the rules, which the imagination can explore. The aesthetic experience in the game is evaluated from the player's pragmatic process as the creator of his own play experience. The creative player has the possibility of turning his computer game experience into an aesthetic exploration where he is affected by the game and affects it from criteria that falls within the realm of beauty. The notion of beauty can be developed by considering it as a relationship between forces where there is rhythm, balance, grace, and harmony that allow the thinking of the aesthetic experience. Drawing on Spinoza, we can say that this beauty is not only a relationship between forces, but also an increase in the agency thanks to the union of forces in composition, as opposed as decomposition, and those two terms are developed by Gilles Deleuze when he is reading the Ethics of Spinoza. So we are reusing those two words by Deleuze. In order of composition, there is a balance of forces toward unity. In decomposition, on the contrary, there is an imbalance and an impossibility of having an aesthetic experience.
The imbalance can be, for instance, when there is the presence of a dominant strategy. So a strategy that is so strong that it surpasses all others by being the best one to choose under any circumstances. So unless the player is not playing to win the game, these strategies will reduce any player's potential of action, any player's agency, because some choices in some strategies will be seen as non-vital. So in this case, it is a case of a part of the game rules decomposing the rest of the game rules. The game is fighting against itself, for instance.
Just as the surfer unites with the wave instead of fighting against it, it's also an example given by Deleuze, the player unites his forces to the games and the other players, in the case of multiplayer games, to increase his agency and to maximize the possibilities included in the game structure. In the aesthetic experience, there is a composition of the player to the game and the other players. Like Dewey, we posit that the aesthetic experience is an experience of unity. It is being as one with the game and the other players, uniting forces to increase them and maximizes the experience, when then becomes the experience of the experience. We could push the idea further and speak of a moment of grace to describe the very moment when the player maximizes his forces to those of the game and the other players.
The notion of moment of grace is very interesting, but it raises some questions. Is the moment of grace the point in time when the player executes the actions, or the moment where he understands how the elements can connect together, which are two separate moments? In many action games, these two moments can occur in near simultaneity. You see new potentials for actions, you execute them. A second later, you see if it works or not. However, it is not unusual for players of strategy games, for instance, to think about their games while they're taking a shower or whatever, and not necessarily be playing the game. At that point, you can understand, thinking back on things or envisioning new possibles through imagination, the eureka, the moment at which things click together and you see a new potential possibility of gameplay. Which of course attests to Dewey's definition of the aesthetic experience as part of the ordinary. So if we represent the experience of playing a game on a timeline, I did what I could with the clip art included in PowerPoint for representing time and representing gameplay. So if this is the temporal line of the aesthetic experience, we can also envision two different moments, a pregnant moment and a moment of grace. The pregnant moment is a concept that was put forth by Gotthold Lessing in 1776, I believe, or anyway, a long time ago. And it's a concept in art history that when you want to represent some mythological action that's part of an unfolding narrative, you choose the moment of maximal dramatic impact, which is not necessarily the point at which someone gets stabbed, but it may be the point at which the knife is raised. The moment is pregnant, and the analogy with pregnancy is really key here. The moment is holding something that is waiting to happen, something future. It calls to attention the fact that it is only a part of something larger that will unfold in due time. So this is really key. We are adapting that concept to a degree, since it was used as a way to identify that moment as part of a narrative of which the particular object was a manifestation. But our usage of it is not focused on the object itself, but on the experience of a given player. So different players will have that pregnant moment or that moment of grace at different times. So it's not about saying this object has a pregnant moment here. It's about saying this or this player lives a pregnant moment, which is then followed later by a moment of grace when the things actually get put together and you see the execution. So the pregnant moment is not like a portrait or a still life, an image to be taken in isolation, but rather it is a part taken out of a whole. It relies on the viewer's imagination to reconstruct the rest of the scene. So the pregnant moment can be assimilated to the eureka moment, and the moment of grace then follows when that new plan is put to the test and reveals a measure of previously unsuspected beauty. Moment of grace is unique and immanent to the player. It's not predetermined by the object, although the object will try to guide the player into having this or this moment at a point or another. That's why game design is a second-ordered problem, as someone mentioned here some time ago in discussion. And this is a game called Mountain Musket. It's a mod of a game called Mountain Blade, actually. And these are all players, and they're all playing their own soldier, and they're all getting in line together and reenacting a big battle, 125 people against 125 people. And so their experience is really focused on making a beautiful line of reenacting that battle well. Not really about winning. Well, it's always nice to win, but it's not really the thing that they really are going for. What is really important is that everybody is going together in the line together, and then they're all facing the enemy, etc., and both sides are engaged in that same experience. In this sense, victory or defeat is not a determinate criterion of aesthetic experience, since this type of experience does not answer to any goal other than itself. So they are living an aesthetic experience of their own choosing, of course. The techne is still there, obviously. They need to manipulate their soldiers and look around and stuff. But the aesthetic dimension takes predominance over the rest for these players at that time. So it is doubled by an aesthetic experience that takes predominance. The battle must, first and foremost, be beautiful.
Though the object does not entirely determine the experience that can be had or of it, or nor can the player do whatever he wants with any given games, there exists a correlation between, on one hand, expertise and mastery over a game, both for knowledge and skill, through the player's exploitation of the affordances, and on the other hand, the actualization of a fully developed aesthetic experience, that is to say, the actualization of the game's ideal aesthetic, what we call idealis, through the game's attributes that shape the affordances. Indeed, the player's imagination depends on his acquired knowledge and skills, and the more it can access, the stronger it will be, since the player will be afforded more possibilities of action. If the player does not know the game or is unable to execute some actions, his aesthetic experience will be limited to those affordances which he can actually make use of. So in conclusion, we'd like to say that the shaping of the potential power of creation that lies in the relationship between the player and the game object, so the aesthetic experience, depends on the knowledge, skills, and prior technical experiences for the full blossoming of the possibilities and potentialities of the computer game. It is in this sense that there is creation, poiesis, a new organization of forces by virtue of the player's imagination working into his relationship with the game, whether it matches what the game's designer or its other players might expect or not. We could thus propose a definition of the possible aesthetic experiences according to whether one pursues the game stated objectives or not. In the first case, the player's aesthetic experience is scribed itself into the Ludus, and in the second, it's rather tributary to the Paidea. So it's two concepts by Roger Caillois, and we pose it as a pole to abstract pole that we cannot reach. It's just to qualify the aesthetic experience, and it's just a two-way of qualifying the aesthetic experience, but we are not saying that's the only way to qualifying it. So this opening towards to a categorization of aesthetic experience will necessitate closer inquiry, but for now we can ascertain the uniqueness of the computer game aesthetic experience. Regardless of whether the player plays as he is expected or not, from his own perspective, he actualizes new possibles and invents for himself a new experience. That is the reason why we claimed earlier that the aesthetic experience is evaluated from the player's pragmatic process as the creator of his own play experience. As such, the aesthetic experience becomes a way of testing oneself and cannot be taught outside of the ethical experience. So what we can ask as ethical question is, what kind of experience will the player be interested in having, both for himself and for the other players when he is playing with others? And another question can be, what will he make of his freedom and creativity? It is no surprise that ever since the Greek antiquity, many philosophers have approached play by associating it with aesthetic, but also ethical questions.
Just as a funny thing, we were walking around the city before the conference, and we noticed this thing on. I think it's the
Academy of Music. Academia
della Musica della Reina Sofia. Sorry. Nulla estetica sine estetica. Well, actually, I mixed them up, but as you can see, it's no ethics without aesthetics and no aesthetics without ethics. So when you're really in your thing, you can see it everywhere, but this was particularly concrete. We even had our own pregnant moment, because there was this kid doing skateboard, and when I was taking the picture, I think he was going to impress us. So this is the pregnant moment, it actually happens, and afterwards there was a moment of grace, but maybe better for us and less graceful for him. He didn't succeed in his trick. So this is the pregnant moment. Thank you.
Yeah, questions, comments? Thank you.
Thank you for a very interesting presentation. Could you explain or expand a little bit more on the relationship between the aesthetic experience and the game prescriptive structure? When we do pervasive games, we are always really concerned with how much room are we leaving or are we giving our players for their own freedom to experiment and all of this. So we're always very concerned with prescription, not to prescribe them so much so that they can find their own aesthetic concern in a way. So what we want is our players to choose whatever form they want to take and reflect about form and aesthetic. So how does this work in your theory?
I'm not sure we can like say, well, do this and it's going to work. But that question is, the relationship is that the game offers and delimits. It offers affordances, of course, and those affordances delimit certain potentials through simulation, which is key in the computer game, as opposed to toys or board games. I mean, you can do a lot of things with your little Monopoly tokens that you can't really do in the computer game unless the computer game allows it. So there is this secondary shaping of potentials, and then the player is free to, of course, follow these potentials or not to. But the thing is that all games offer a collaboration. It's like the game offers a hand and the player can take it or refuse it, but in my view, and this is really personal, but if he refuses it, then he has no right to complain that the game doesn't allow this or that. Well, that's not what the game is supposed to be about. You can try to make your own thing out of it, just like some artist that I don't remember had a video of my trip to Liberty City, where he was going through Grand Theft Auto 3, I believe, and, well, yeah, 3, Liberty City. And he was just driving like a regular tourist and, you know, making stops at the red lights and stuff. But if you do that, you have to fight against the affordances of the system, because when you play Grand Theft Auto, as soon as you press the button to accelerate, whoa, your car goes out, because you're not supposed to just be driving slowly, and people throw themselves everywhere. So, I mean, of course, you can do that, but the potential for actions is delimited by the game, and if you choose to go against them, then it's really hard, but you can also have an aesthetic experience through that if you feel like it.
We show that it's not the aesthetic experience, it's not depending on the player or the object, it's really the relationship between the both, and it's a really dynamic way of considering the aesthetic experience. But for sure, certain player will easily have aesthetic experience because of their past experience, their desire, or whatever, their personality, and some games will produce more easily the aesthetic experience because of the way they are constructed, the liberty they are given for the interpretation. And that's why we show at the beginning Trauma, because it's a really beautiful game and a very explorative game. But at the same time, you can be really bored, so you cannot live an aesthetic experience with that game if you are not that type of player. So, and you can live a very strong aesthetic experience if you are playing a World of Warcraft and you are doing a battle and killing the boss, and everybody, you are 25 players together and you are living something there at the moment of grace, and it's really hard, really strong, and it's not, World of Warcraft doesn't want at the beginning to make live aesthetic experience as Trauma wanted to. So it's the relationship.
Yeah, could you a bit clarify the concept you call in and of itself action? That what is the function of those actions in aesthetic experience? Because if you recall my term, integral aesthetic experience, I think you're kind of missing that.
Well, I sort of jumped at the in and of itself because there's a whole footnote dedicated to it.
Yeah, that's what I have here.
Oh, you have it? Oh, okay. So I don't have to read it. In and of itself is really important in that you actually want to live this thing or do this thing or do this skateboard trick because you want to do that skateboard trick, and not as an instrumentalized function used to progress through the game. If you have to do it to progress to get to the good part, then what you're doing now is not really enjoyed in and of itself of your own free will. You're putting your free will to a larger problem or desire. You want to reach that part of the game, but to do so, you have first to do this. So, okay, you do this as an instrumentalized way of going through it before you can get to the part that you're going to enjoy in and of itself, aka mob grinding in MMORPGs. I have to do circles and kill people before I can play with my friends or whatever.
Yeah, but do we quite directly states that struggle can be enjoyed if it's part of the longer integral aesthetic experience. So,
But he says that it can be enjoyed?
it can be enjoyed, struggle.
Sure.
So, but not as an aesthetic experience itself.
Yeah,
But
sure.
You agree with that?
You can still enjoy it.
Okay.
I agree.
In an aesthetic sense.
Yeah. What, in a non-aesthetic sense?
In an aesthetic sense.
Well, I would say that,
Well, going back to the puzzle, you solve a puzzle which is a struggle. So would you agree that that's an aesthetic experience? Solving or shooting someone is a challenge, a game challenge, any game challenge.
well, sure, if you like it in and of itself, sure. You're having an aesthetic experience of that puzzle. When I play adventure games, I like the puzzles. And your conception can change, of course. So you play that game and you're like, oh, not this stupid puzzle. And then well, it's actually cool. And then you start really enjoying it. Yes, at first you were going through it just to get to whatever next that you wanted to live. That was really at the heart of your free will. But your thing can change through the experience, I think. But let's discuss more.
Just one question at the end. Do you see your approach as informing? There was the discussion on the first day. I think you maybe remember if you were here about this this idea of the player being a kind of co-author of the narrative that derives from the game, or do you think that's completely irrelevant as a kind of issue in the whole place?
Regarding narrative, I guess I would say I'm a neoconservative. So for me, a co-author is something that is clearly not what is happening in regular computer games because, well, you're acting with a voice inside the constraints that are put forth by the author who is external to the object, but you have to go through the object to interact with it. So unless you're making mods and stuff, then it's not really co-authorship in my mind.
But we see with some players that are becoming co-author, but they are taking the game and doing something else with the game. So they are appropriating the game. A lot of artists are doing that. They are taking a part of it and deconstructing it to change the meaning of it, and it's not the game anymore in a sense. So it's not the co-author of the game, it's the co-author or the author of something else, piece of art or other games. So.
I just wanted to add one thing. Just remember that when we were talking about that, the whole idea was that each individual session in itself, if you read it from outside, can be seen as a narrative. And when the players themselves take choices which either conflict with or use constructively the things that the designers have presupposed for the game, in that sense that they do have a word to say in what that particular session can be described as in narrative terms. That was all.
In terms of narrative, though, it's not a bi-directional conversation. It's a one-sided applying of choosing between or enacting certain pre-existing possibilities. So that's my.
Okay, thank you.
C'est sur le récit.